Hi, it's pretty late here in the Netherlands where I live. My name is Hedvig, I'm Swedish and I'm a linguistics major, and I was recently sent this video from Pogobat, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry, in which he talked about how we will talk in the future, and he brought up several interesting points, and I wanted to comment on a few of those. So here we go. So first of all, I thought the video was very good, and I thought it brought up a lot of good, important points that we need to consider when we're talking about these things. There were some things that maybe we could talk more about. So, one thing is linguists tend to talk about languages and dialects as if we know what they are. Turns out we don't. Languages, there's a continuum, and there are lots of language varieties on that continuum, and any sharp border, like this is a dialect, this is another dialect, this is a language, this is not a language, is always going to be more or less arbitrary. But what's important when we're talking about languages is to understand the importance of social groups. So we belong to different social groups that can be more, or that can be big or small. A lot of people belong to a social group of a nation, in which there's a majority language that we somehow usually participate in. And that's the language on TV and the language in the newspapers, etc. But there's also the language in school, the language at home, the language with your friends, the language at work. There are all these different social settings, and in each one of these there is more or less a different language, or language varieties as we like to call them. So the smallest element of this continuum is of course the individual, and the individual can participate in lots of different groups and will change their language in all of these different groups. And one thing that has happened in the last 100 years that is new to language change is mobility. So people can move a lot more, people can travel to other cities, people are no longer confined to their small geographical area and the group that they have there. And this has escalated, so if we think of the starting point here as a railroad, we're now at the point where we have internet, in which I can share cultural references with somebody living on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, etc., which is very cool. So that's the first point I wanted to add about how we will talk in the future. We will have, how am I to put this in a good way? Okay, the nerds are coming. We can center around new topics that are narrow and very dear and near to us, and there's a critical mass. There's many people out there who are also interested in it for us to form a group and communicate about that subject. This has never been, this reality is new. This hasn't been possible in this way before, and that is interesting. Even, I mean, just understanding American dialects is new to us, and that's a fairly recent development. So now understanding what internet is going to do to us, where we're not only colonizing and having railroads and doing all this stuff, but we also have, just internet. And another important thing to think about when we talk about language change is economy versus expressivity. So there's a drive in all life to use as little effort as possible to get the result. So if I'm talking to a dear friend of mine, she knows me very well, I can probably say, you know, that thing that we did before, blah 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 blah. And not only does she know what I'm referring to, even though I'm giving her very limited information, she's also more used to my voice and the words I choose, and she's good at predicting what I'm gonna say, and she's good at putting herself in my shoes, basically. And that is gonna mean that I don't have to make as much of an effort when I talk to her. So I'm gonna be economical and not do that if I can. But at the same time, I want to be enough expressive. I don't want my statements to be ambiguous and mean several different things. I want her to understand exactly which guy it was that I saw yesterday, or whatever it was. So there is economy and expressivity, and we linguists tend to think as if they balance each other out. This is sometimes known as hypo, by many different names in linguistics. But so that's always one thing to remember. And as we now form these new social groups, we within those social groups we can create a language variety that is sufficiently expressive in that group, not necessarily outside. But suddenly that group is geographically diverse, and perhaps ethnically and socially and economically as well. So that's new. These things are both good and bad. If you live in a small town and you used to be the only person who liked bright eyes or whatever it is, you might have felt very lonely, but there were other people there and you had to adapt to them and conform in a certain manner to their life and their choices. And conformity is not only a bad thing, it can be a good thing too. So, no judging. We have both. And there are also negative side effects when we think about how we are more and more putting ourselves in a bubble where we are choosing what content we are consuming more and more and more. So we are less subjected to things we did not expect, basically. So my RSS feed and my Facebook feed, etc., all consist of content that I have actively chosen to take part of every day, which means that sometimes certain news events can just totally pass me by, like Eurovision Song Contest. I see the updates on Facebook, but I don't care. This is maybe not familiar to Americans, but Eurovision Song Contest is a big thing, in Sweden in particular. I had no idea who won, because I don't read newspapers. I watch popular science shows from America. I know more about what NASA is doing than, you know, Eurovision. Because I've chosen it that way. And these are both good and bad things. And secondly, the other thing I wanted to talk about was, you talked about so there can be different motivations behind learning language, right? So one motivation can be become a member of that group. So if you want to become a member of native speakers of English, for example, which is a very big group, but still, you might want to be a member of that. I do, even though I'm not. You want to imitate every part of that language, even the things that as Pogobat described might be unnecessary in the communicative situation. So one thing in English is, for example, you have in and un when you want to make an opposite. So you say inefficient, but you say unlikable. Now, that can sometimes be a bit hard as a non-native speaker to know which one it is. And the meaning difference is close to zero, if not zero. But if you master things like that, you will come off as a native speaker, and that might be something you want. But if you do not need to be a native speaker in order for that situation that you're in to work, you don't have any motivation for learning those things. So as we see more and more non-native speakers, we might expect certain elements perhaps to become less common in their speech, and like was pointed out in the video, we get native speakers perhaps imitating non-native speakers. And these are all extremely interesting things that we as linguists know very little about. You'd be surprised. We do not know enough about this at all. And but one thing we do know is that it can be very controversial to talk about languages having a lot of these things or very few of these things, because it's sometimes attached to expressions of judgment. So that a language that has more of these, what are sometimes called frills, and sometimes called mature patterns, and sometimes called redundant patterns, and these are all slightly different terms. And there's another good word you can learn, which is shibboleth, which is a device whose only meaningful component is telling you whether you are a member of that group or not. So mastering in and out, for example, is pretty close to shibboleth, because if you master it, people will still understand you created an opposite, but people will know that you're a native speaker of English, and that can be useful. That can be a meaning you want to communicate sometimes. So we do know that we don't know many things about this, but whether things are so this is attached also to the issue of complexity, whether all languages are equally complex. And sometimes you get news about, oh, this language is exceptionally easy to learn or something like that. And they tend not to be true most of the time. But there is a discussion going on whether complexity is indeed equal in all languages, and what would that mean. And to make this harder, we also have the problem of whether we are comparing the same thing, because the documents, there's a difference between written and spoken discourse that is quite big, and we want to make sure we're comparing the same things in all languages. So those were my 2 cents. I think, yes, I will stop right there. Thank you for making the video, and yeah, I'm looking forward to subscribing to your channel and see what else is coming up.